Welcome to Dear HOA. I'm Michael Vincent, and today I'm bringing you a case that, when I first received it, I could barely believe what I was reading. Picture this. You inherit 47 acres of pine forest from your grandmother, a family legacy maintained for 40 years. Then one morning, you wake up to the sound of chainsaws. The HOA is logging 24 mature Douglas firs on your land. No permission, no notice. Just the roar of machinery and the smell of fresh-cut timber in the air. This wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate scheme spanning over a decade, and the man behind it thought he'd get away with it. He was wrong. If this is your first time on the channel, hit subscribe right now, because this story will show you exactly how an environmental lawyer dismantled a corruption empire using survey maps, timber appraisals, and Oregon state law. Now, let me take you to Pine Ridge, Oregon, where it all began. The chainsaw sound started at 6:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my phone before I even opened my eyes, thinking maybe a neighbor had hired a tree service. But the sound was wrong. Too close. Too many machines running at once. I got out of bed and walked to the window overlooking the property line where my grandmother's forest began. 47 acres of Douglas fir and western hemlock, trees she'd planted and tended since 1978. Through the glass, I watched three men in high-vis vests working methodically through the stand. One operated a Husqvarna felling saw, another guided a bobcat with a grapple arm. The third stood near a flatbed truck, marking measurements on a clipboard. Dawn light cut through the canopy at sharp angles, illuminating columns of sawdust that hung in the air like gold powder. The smell hit me next, that sharp, sweet scent of fresh-cut pine resin that meant living wood, not deadfall. I counted 12 trees already down, mature Douglas firs, 60 to 80 years old, their root systems still clutching soil that wouldn't hold them anymore. The stumps were neat, professional cuts at 18 inches above ground. This wasn't storm cleanup. This was logging. I pulled on jeans and boots and went outside. The morning air was cold enough to see my breath. I walked across the dew-wet grass toward the tree line, and that's when I saw the orange plastic fencing they'd erected. The kind construction crews used to mark work zones. It ran along what they apparently thought was the boundary between the HOA common area and private land. Except they had placed it 30 feet inside my property line. I knew because I'd walked this boundary with my grandmother every summer since I was 8 years old. She'd shown me the iron survey stakes, taught me to read the deed legal description, and made me memorize the metes and bounds. The man with the clipboard noticed me approaching. He said something into a radio. The chainsaws didn't stop. "You need to halt work," I called out, loud enough to be heard over the machinery. "This is private property." The man gestured for the crew to pause. The saws wound down to idle, then silence. In the sudden quiet, I could hear the bobcat's diesel engine ticking as it cooled. "I'm Richard Blackwood," the man said. He was late 50s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of casual authority that comes from years of not being questioned. HOA President, this is scheduled common area maintenance per board resolution. We sent notice 2 weeks ago. I kept my voice level. "I'm Alex Morgan. I own this land, 47 acres deeded to me through inheritance. You're cutting trees on private property." Richard barely glanced at me. He flipped a page on his clipboard. "The boundary map in our records shows this as an HOA common forest. We're clearing hazard trees per our safety improvement project." "Your map is wrong," I said. I pulled out my phone, opened the Photos app, where I had saved a scan of the deed. "This is the recorded property deed. Legal description, survey coordinates, everything. That tree you just cut," I pointed to a fresh stump 10 feet away, "is 60 feet inside my boundary line." Richard took the phone, squinted at the screen for maybe 5 seconds, then handed it back. "Maps from the 80s aren't always accurate. Survey technology's improved. We'll have our surveyor review it, but the project continues on schedule until we have definitive proof otherwise." He made a circular motion with his hand. The chainsaw operator pulled the starter cord. The Husqvarna roared back to life. I stood there watching him walk back to his truck. He climbed into the cab, made a phone call, and glanced at me once through the windshield. Then he drove off, leaving his crew to finish the job. The bobcat operator was already dragging another downed tree toward the flatbed. They worked with the efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. You might think I should have called the police right then, but Oregon has complicated timber trespass statutes. If I couldn't immediately prove the boundary, the HOA could claim good faith mistake and tie the case up in civil court for years. I needed documentation. I needed time. So I did what any good lawyer does when the fight starts before you're ready. I gathered evidence. I walked the perimeter of their work zone, taking photos from every angle. 18 Douglas firs down so far, diameters ranging from 24 to 32 inches at breast height. I photographed the stumps with a measuring tape for scale. I photographed the orange fencing and the gap between it and the actual survey stakes. Still there, half buried in moss, exactly where my grandmother had shown me. I photographed the truck's license plate and the logo on the workers' shirts, Blackwood Timber LLC. Same last name as Richard. Interesting. When I got back to the house, I called the county recorder's office. The clerk confirmed my deed was current, recorded, and legally valid. She offered to email me a certified copy. I said yes. Then I checked my mailbox. There it was, a form letter from Pine Ridge HOA, dated 2 weeks prior, announcing planned tree removal on common land to address fire safety concerns and unstable growth. No parcel number, no specific location, no map, just broad language about community benefit and board-approved maintenance. I stood in my driveway holding that letter, listening to the chainsaws start up again in the distance. The morning sun was fully up now, bright and cold. I thought about my grandmother's hands, scarred from decades of pruning and planting. She'd bought this land in '78 for $47,000, $1,000 per acre, back when Pine Ridge was just a logging road and a post office. She'd told me once, land doesn't lie, but people do. I was starting to understand what she meant. By noon, they'd taken 6 more trees, 24 total. I watched from the kitchen window as they loaded the last log onto the flatbed. Richard's truck returned around 1 p.m. He spoke briefly with the crew foreman, then they packed up and left. The work zone sat empty after that, just stumps and sawdust and the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with pine. I opened my grandmother's records that evening. She'd kept everything in a fireproof filing cabinet, original survey maps from '87, property tax receipts going back 40 years, correspondence with the county, photos of the forest at different seasons. At the bottom of the stack, I found a letter dated June 2015. It was addressed to Richard Blackwood, HOA president. The subject line read, "Formal notice, cease trespass on private forest land." In the letter, my grandmother documented an incident where the HOA had built a gazebo 30 feet inside her property line. She'd provided survey evidence, demanded removal, and threatened legal action. Richard had responded with an apology, claimed it was an honest surveying error, and promised it would never happen again. The gazebo was removed within a week. He'd known since 2015 exactly where her property line was, which meant he knew exactly where mine was now. This wasn't confusion about boundaries. This was something else. I drafted the email at 11 p.m. that night. Subject line, formal demand, halt logging operations on private property. I attached the certified deed copy, survey map from 1987, and 32 photos documenting the trespass. I kept the language direct. Identify the violation, cite the legal basis, demand immediate cessation, and request an emergency meeting. The email went out at 11:43 p.m. I got an auto reply confirming receipt. 48 hours later, a 2-sentence response from HOA administration. Your concern has been noted and will be reviewed at the next scheduled monthly meeting. I checked the calendar, 3 weeks away. I called the office number. Jennifer Hartley, board secretary, answered with practiced neutrality. Richard's schedule was completely booked. Emergency meetings required a petition from 10% of homeowners. My issue would be addressed through proper channels. When I mentioned the 2015 letter proving Richard knew the boundary, she paused exactly 3 seconds. The board will review all historical records. Then she ended the call. This was the playbook. Bury opponents in procedure while the damage continues. Most people give up. Richard had been doing this for 12 years. He knew exactly how long people lasted before exhaustion won. The following Tuesday, engines again. Same crew, different section of forest. 6 more Douglas firs were marked with orange spray paint along the eastern edge. I walked out as the foreman started his chainsaw. He saw me coming and held up a hand, not greeting, warning. A black Ford F-250 pulled up before I could speak. Richard climbed out wearing work boots and a Carhartt jacket, clipboard under one arm. He didn't hurry. The board is reviewing your email, he said, tone casual. Project continues per approved plan. You have the deed. Legal survey, you have no authority here. Your 1980s map has discrepancies. He didn't look at me, eyes on the marked trees instead. Until we complete formal reconciliation, we proceed based on recorded common area boundaries. You admitted the boundary in 2015. Now he looked at me. A gazebo isn't timber management. We're talking community safety, fire risk, liability exposure. The board protects all homeowners, not one person's interpretation of an old survey. He turned to the foreman. Go ahead. The chainsaws started. Richard walked to his truck, made a phone call, and drove off. No argument. No negotiation. Just execution of authority. The crew worked for 3 hours. 6 more trees down, 30 total. That evening, it called Daniel Ross, a property attorney from a previous case. I laid it out. Inherited land, clear deed, logging without permission, prior boundary knowledge, refusal to stop. Daniel asked 3 questions. Current survey, timber appraisal, documentation of all HOA contacts. I had the deed and the old survey. Photos and emails, no new survey, no appraisal. You need both, Daniel said. Oregon Timber Trespass Law, ORS 105.810, allows treble damages for intentional cutting, but you need ironclad proof. A professional survey costs $3,000 to $4,000. Forestry appraisal is another $2,000 to $3,000. If they cut $80,000 in timber value, you're entitled to $240,000, plus attorney fees. It's designed to deter exactly this. I did the math. 30 mature Douglas firs, 60 to 80 years old, $70,000 to $90,000 in timber, times 3. Something shifted in my chest. Not anger anymore, but clarity. Start the paperwork, I said. I'll get the survey and appraisal. That night, someone knocked on my door. Heather Morris from 4 houses down, 67, retired teacher, Pine Ridge resident since 2005. We'd exchanged pleasantries at events, but never really talked. I heard about your trees, she said. Can I come in? She sat at my kitchen table and folded her hands. 2019. The HOA fined me $500 for planting an oak tree without approval. I showed them it was on my property, everything legal. Richard increased the fine to $2,000 for willful defiance. Then he offered a deal, drop the fine to $0 if I let them remove 5 oaks on my lot edge. Trees they claimed encroached on a drainage easement. He'd pay me $5,000, and I'd sign a non-disclosure agreement. She watched my face. I was scared. I signed. Blackwood Timber cuts every tree. I kept the emails, photos, and the NDA. I couldn't talk about it until now. Agreement expires in 6 months. But after hearing about your situation, she pulled a manila folder from her purse. You should know you're not the first. I opened the folder. Email correspondence. Photos of stumps where mature oaks had stood, a signed settlement agreement with Richard's signature at the bottom. The pattern was there in black and white. Identify a property owner who won't fight back. Manufacture a violation. Offer a deal that looks like mercy. Profit from the timber. Silence the victim. Heather had been alone. She'd taken the settlement because fighting seemed impossible. There are at least 2 others, Heather said quietly. Maybe more, but they're afraid. Richard controls everything. The architectural committee, the violation hearings, the vendor contracts. If you fight him, he makes your life hell until you leave or submit. I looked at the documents spread across my table. This wasn't about trees anymore. This was about a system designed to extract value from people too isolated or intimidated to resist. Richard had built it carefully over 12 years, and it had worked because he'd never faced someone who knew how to dismantle it piece by piece using the same bureaucratic machinery he'd weaponized. Thank you for this, I said. Heather stood to leave, then paused at the door. 2019, I was alone. Don't let that happen to you. She left the folder on my table. I stayed up past midnight reading every page. The pattern was clear, the evidence was building, and Richard had no idea what was coming. The post appeared on the community forum 3 days after my conversation with Heather. I found it because a neighbor I barely knew sent me a screenshot with the message, "Is this about you?" The post was titled, "Safety Concerns versus Individual Objections," and it was written with careful legal distance. No names, but the details were unmistakable. It described a resident who was blocking essential tree removal work that the board had determined necessary for fire safety and storm damage prevention. The post claimed these trees posed significant risk to surrounding homes, and that the board was working diligently to balance individual property claims with community welfare. It asked residents to remain patient while we navigate this complex situation. The comments filled in what the post left unsaid. Someone asked if this was about the logging near Maple Ridge Drive. Another said they'd heard chainsaws for days and wondered what was happening. A third comment, from an account labeled as a verified HOA board member, explained that the trees in question were dangerous old growth that could fall during winter storms and damage multiple properties. The post included a photo of the forest taken from an angle that made the trees look precarious, leaning toward houses. I knew that angle. It was taken from the access road with a telephoto lens, compressing perspective to create an illusion of instability. The trees weren't leaning, they were straight-trunked Douglas firs that had survived 80 years of Pacific Northwest weather. By the next morning, the post had 43 comments. Most supported the HOA. A few questioned whether proper surveys had been done, but those comments were buried under responses about trust in elected leadership and not letting one person hold the community hostage. Nobody used my name, but everybody knew. I started getting looks at the mailbox. A neighbor who used to wave when I drove past now looked away. Another slowed his car as he passed my driveway, stared at the forest edge where the stumps were visible, then drove on without acknowledging me. I wanted to respond on the forum, but Daniel advised against it. Anything you say will be used to paint you as difficult or unreasonable, he told me over the phone. They're building a narrative. Don't feed it. Let the legal process speak. So I stayed silent while the story spread, became accepted truth through repetition. The person is blocking essential safety work. The individual puts property claims above community welfare. The outsider who didn't understand how things worked in Pine Ridge. That night I lay awake thinking about how easy it is to erase someone's reality when you control the narrative. I had the deed. I had the survey. I had the law on my side. But the community believed what Richard told them because he'd been telling them what to believe for 12 years. And I was just the person who'd inherited land 6 months ago. The truth didn't matter if nobody wanted to hear it. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 7 p.m. in the community center. I arrived at 6:55. The parking lot was fuller than usual, about 30 cars, twice the normal attendance. Inside, the meeting room was arranged theater-style, with rows of folding chairs facing a long table where the board sat. Richard was in the center seat. Jennifer sat to his right, with a laptop and a stack of binders. 3 other board members filled the remaining seats. I took a chair in the third row. A few people glanced at me. Most didn't. Richard called the meeting to order at 7:03. He went through standard business, approval of last month's minutes, financial report, and architectural committee updates. Then he reached the agenda item labeled Common Area Forestry Project Update. He stood and walked to a presentation screen, clicked through slides showing photos of the logging site, budget figures, and a timeline. He explained that the project was proceeding on schedule despite some initial confusion about property boundaries. He said the board had consulted with a surveyor who confirmed that the work was being conducted on HOA common land and that they were committed to transparency and following proper procedure. He didn't mention my name. He didn't mention my emails or my deed or the 2015 letter from my grandmother. When he finished, he asked if there were any questions. I raised my hand. Jennifer looked at her laptop screen and said, "The speaking roster is full for tonight. You're welcome to submit written comments for next month's meeting." I stayed standing. "I own the land where you're logging," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I have the deed and survey proving it. This isn't a boundary dispute. It's trespassing." Richard smiled with practiced patience. "We appreciate your input, but this isn't the appropriate forum for individual property disputes. If you believe you have a claim, you're welcome to pursue it through proper legal channels. We're not going to derail a community meeting for one person's grievances." A few people nodded. Someone in the back said, "Let's move on." Jennifer made a note on her laptop. Richard returned to his seat and moved to the next agenda item, proposed landscaping upgrades for the main entrance. I sat down. My face felt hot. My hands were shaking slightly. I'd been dismissed in under 90 seconds, my objection reframed as an inappropriate disruption. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes. Nobody spoke to me. When it ended, people filed out in clusters, talking about the landscaping proposal and upcoming holiday events. I walked to my car alone. When I got home, I pulled out my grandmother's filing cabinet again. At the back of the drawer, underneath tax records and insurance documents, I found her personal journal from 2015. She'd written about the gazebo incident in careful cursive. Richard Blackwood tried to claim our land today. When I showed him proof, he apologized, but his eyes told a different story. He'll try again. Men like that always do. On the next page, dated a week later, gazebo removed. Richard promised it won't happen again. I don't believe him. This land has been in our family for 40 years. Some people see 40 years of care as an obstacle to their plans. I hope Alex remembers. Land doesn't lie, but people do. Stand firm. I'm Michael Vincent, the person bringing you this story today on Dear HOA. Now, pause for a moment. If you were in Alex's position here, trees illegally logged, community turned against you, and you've just discovered the HOA did this before to your own grandmother, what would you do next? Would you back down, or would you keep fighting? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what solution you think is best here, because what Alex does next changes everything. Thanks for staying with me on this. I closed the journal and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. The isolation was working exactly as designed. Make the target feel crazy for insisting on documented facts. Bury them in procedure. Turn the community into an audience that watches their exclusion without intervening. It's a system that runs on silence and exhaustion. Most people break under it, but I kept thinking about that line in my grandmother's journal. Stand firm. She'd faced Richard before and won. She'd documented everything, kept records, and refused to be moved by intimidation or social pressure. She'd taught me that preparation beats power, that evidence outlasts charm, that the law works if you know how to use it. If you were in my place, what would you do? Would you accept the narrative they're building, or would you trust what you can prove? That's the question I asked myself that night, and the answer was clear. I hired the surveyor on Monday morning. Keith Brennan, licensed in Oregon since 1998, has 26 years of boundary dispute experience. $3,200 for a full property survey with legal exhibit quality drawings. He could start on Thursday. Keith arrived at 7:30 a.m. with a two-person crew, a total station on a tripod, and GPS accurate to centimeter precision. They started at the northwest corner, where my grandmother's original survey had placed an iron rod monument in 1987. Keith spent 40 minutes clearing brush and topsoil. At 8:12, his assistant found it, a half-inch rebar stake with an aluminum cap stamped with the surveyor's license number and the year. Keith photographed it, recorded GPS coordinates, and moved to the next corner. By noon, they'd found all four original corner monuments exactly where the 87 survey said they'd be. Keith called me over to the eastern boundary line. He pointed to a fresh-looking iron stake about 30 feet inside my property. "This one's new," he said. "See the rust pattern? These oxidize within 6 months. This is maybe 8 to 12 weeks old." He scraped soil away. "Disturbed earth. Someone planted this recently." He checked his GPS. "It's not on any recorded survey, not county records, not my database. Someone put it here to create confusion." The orange fencing Richard's crew used runs in a straight line connecting these new stakes. Stakes with no legal validity, but official-looking enough to justify logging if you didn't verify the actual boundary. Keith shook his head. 30 years doing this, I've seen boundary manipulation. But planting fake monuments? That's evidence of intent. By Friday, Keith had the preliminary plat map. The legal boundary was marked in bold red. The HOAs claimed boundary in dotted blue. Every tree they had cut fell 30 to 60 feet inside the red line. Keith had marked each stump with a surveyed point. Douglas fir, 32-inch diameter, located 43 feet inside recorded property line. 24 trees, 24 violations. At the bottom of the map, evidence of boundary marker tampering observed and documented. This wasn't a mistake anymore. It was deliberate deception, and the survey proved it. Next was timber appraisal. Robert Chen, certified forestry consultant with 30 years of Pacific Northwest timber valuation experience. $2,800 for courtroom-ready documentation. He walked the property on Tuesday, measuring stumps, examining growth rings, and taking core samples from standing trees to establish age and health. Douglas fir reaches premium value between 60 and 80 years, exactly the age of these trees. His preliminary calculation: 24 trees, 800 to 1,200 board feet each. Total harvest value, approximately $87,400. Under Oregon Revised Statute 105.810, Roberts said, intentional timber trespass entitles you to treble damages. That's $262,200, plus attorney fees if you prevail. This statute exists to deter exactly this behavior. You can't replace decades of growth with a check. The law recognizes that. He promised a full report within 10 days. Species identification, volume calculations, market analysis, everything formatted for legal proceedings. Why hadn't I filed a lawsuit yet? Because in property litigation, timing is everything. I needed complete evidence, not just about the trees, but about the pattern underneath. One strong case beats 10 rushed cases. If I filed too early, Richard's lawyers could drown me in procedural delays. But if I waited until every piece was documented and verified, I could walk into court with a case so airtight there would be nothing to argue. That's how you win against institutional power, not by fighting harder, but by building better. While waiting for final reports, I requested HOA financial records. Oregon law, ORS 94.670, gives homeowners the right to inspect association books and records. I sent a formal request to Jennifer for 3 years of forestry and landscaping contracts. Jennifer responded 4 days later. Financial records contain confidential vendor information and are not available for general member inspection. Daniel drafted a second request with explicit statutory language and a warning about sanctions. 10 days later, Jennifer sent a 3-inch binder with half the pages redacted, vendor names blacked out. Contract amounts are visible, but dates are missing. Technical compliance, nearly useless. Nearly, but not completely. I spent 2 evenings cross-referencing what remained. Line items for forestry maintenance. $14,000 in year 1, $16,000 in year 2, $15,000 in year 3, $45,000 total. No invoices, no scope of work documents, no competitive bidding records. I pulled LLC registration records from the Oregon Secretary of State website. Public information. Blackwood Timber, LLC. Registered April 2017. Principal owner, Richard Blackwood. The pattern was visible now. The HOA was paying Richard's company tens of thousands with no competitive bidding, no documentation of vendor selection. His company had just logged $87,000 of my timber he could sell while billing the HOA for removal. Double revenue, no oversight. I called Daniel and sent everything: survey, appraisal, financial records, and LLC registration. He was quiet for 30 seconds. Then, "Alex, this isn't just timber trespass. This is embezzlement, conflict of interest, potentially fraud. You're sitting on something much bigger than property damage. When this goes public, it's not about your trees. It's about how Richard's been running the HOA for years." I understood. It meant Richard wouldn't settle quietly. The board would fracture. Every homeowner who'd paid dues while Richard funneled contracts to himself would want answers. This fight was about to get much bigger. But the evidence would speak for itself. No narrative control could overcome bank records, survey maps, and state statutes. "Keep building the file," Daniel said. "When we move once, and we move hard." I hung up and looked at the documents spread across my desk. Survey proving trespass, appraisal proving damages, financial records prove a pattern, statutory law provides remedies. Every piece fits together. Richard thought he was fighting someone who would get tired and give up. He didn't realize he was fighting someone who knew exactly how to build a case that would end him. Heather called me Tuesday evening. Her voice was careful, measured. "There's someone you should meet," she said. "Can you come to my house tomorrow at 6? She didn't say who. She didn't explain why. Just bring a notebook. I arrived at 5:58. Heather answered the door and led me to her living room. A woman sat on the couch, mid-40s, athletic build, graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. Heather introduced her as Sarah Vega, a former HOA board member who'd resigned in 2022. Sarah shook my hand with the grip of someone who'd made a difficult decision and wanted me to know it mattered. "I quit because I couldn't watch it anymore," Sarah said. She pulled a manila envelope from her bag. "I was on the board for 3 years. At first, I thought Richard was just thorough, detail-oriented. But during budget meetings, questions about vendor contracts would get deflected or buried in procedural motions. When I pushed for competitive bidding on the forestry contracts, Jennifer would suddenly discover we were out of time, had to table the discussion. It happened 4 times. Same pattern. She opened the envelope and spread papers across Heather's coffee table. Email printouts, meeting minutes, and budget spreadsheets. 2021, she said, pointing to a budget line. $16,000 for tree removal and forestry maintenance. I asked for the vendor list. Richard said Blackwood Timber had the specialized equipment and local knowledge. I asked if we'd solicited other bids. He said the board had evaluated options in executive session. When I requested those session notes, Jennifer said they were privileged under legal advice. Sarah pulled out another page, an email chain from March 2022. This is when I realized I was copying files from my own records and found this in Jennifer's sent folder by accident. It's Richard instructing her to adjust the common area boundary map to maximize usable timber access. Those are his exact words, not correct the map or verify the survey. Maximize usable timber access, like he was planning a harvest operation on land that wasn't ours. I read the email twice. The subject line, property line clarification, Maple Ridge sector. Richard's message was 3 sentences. Clinical, businesslike, no doubt about what he meant. Below it, Jennifer's reply. Updated map attached. Should give us clear access to the mature growth along the eastern ridge. Attached was a PDF, the same boundary map Richard had used to justify logging my trees. The map with the fake survey stakes. I confronted him privately, Sarah continued, asked why we were adjusting boundaries instead of confirming them with a real surveyor. He said I was overcomplicating routine administrative updates and suggested I might be happier focusing on social committees instead of operations. 2 weeks later, I resigned. I couldn't prove anything illegal, but I couldn't participate in it either. Heather poured coffee while I photographed every page. 23 documents total. Most were routine board communications, but 3 were damning. The boundary map email, a text exchange about managing that property owner, likely referring to my grandmother in 2015, and budget notes showing Blackwood Timber had received 90% of all landscaping and forestry contracts since 2017. 5 years. $340,000. No competitive bidding records. No vendor comparison spreadsheets. Just contract after contract awarded to Richard's company. Think about this with me. If Richard only made a mistake about the boundary, why would he instruct Jennifer to adjust the map instead of ordering a professional survey? Why would he need to maximize timber access if he genuinely believed it was HOA land? Why would he tell a board member to stop asking questions instead of simply showing her the documentation? Each piece alone might have an innocent explanation, but together they only point one direction. I thanked Sarah and Heather and drove home with the copies. That night I couldn't sleep, so I did what lawyers do when the case shifts. I pulled everything together and looked for gaps. I had survey proof of trespass, appraisal proof of damages, financial records showing Richard's self-dealing, Heather's testimony about the 2019 incident. Sarah's emails prove Richard knew he was manipulating boundaries. The pattern was complete. But I needed one more piece, direct evidence that Richard understood he was taking my property specifically, not just making aggressive interpretations of the common area. Thursday morning, I drove to the county recorder's office. Public records are underrated. People forget that property transactions, surveys, and legal notices are all accessible if you know where to look. I requested the complete file for my parcel, every deed, every survey, every recorded document since the land was first platted. The clerk brought out a folder 3 inches thick. I sat at a research table and started going through it page by page. Halfway through, I found it. A 1987 letter from the county surveyor to my grandmother, confirming the boundary monumentation and legal description. Clipped to it was a photocopy receipt showing this letter had been requested by someone in 2015. The requester's name, Richard Blackwood. He'd pulled the same file I was looking at now. He'd seen the professional survey. He'd known precisely where the legal boundary was. And then he'd logged my trees anyway. I photographed the letter and the receipt. My hands were shaking slightly, not from anger, from the clarity of it. Richard hadn't made a mistake. He hadn't relied on outdated maps. He'd done his homework, confirmed the boundary, then deliberately planted fake stakes and logged my timber because he thought I wouldn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. He'd done it before with Heather, gotten away with it, and refined the system. Every step was calculated. I saw Richard 2 days later in the community center parking lot. He was loading boxes into his truck, probably HOA supplies. I pulled in 3 spaces away. When I got out, he glanced over, and for just a second, his expression changed. Not fear exactly, uncertainty. His hand hesitated on the truck bed, and he looked at me without the easy confidence he'd had before. His jaw was tight. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just got in his truck and drove away faster than necessary. It was the first time I'd seen him without full control of the situation. The first crack in the facade, that's when I knew. He suspected something was coming. He just didn't know what, or when, or how prepared I was, and that uncertainty was its own kind of power. Daniel drafted the demand letter over 3 days. 12 pages, single-spaced, with 7 exhibits attached. Survey map showing the true boundary versus the HOA's fabricated stakes. Timber appraisal calculated $87,400 in market value. Keith's documentation report documenting the planted fake markers. Sarah's emails prove Richard knew the real boundary. Financial records showing Blackwood Timber's contracts. Heather's 2019 settlement agreement and photos. My grandmother's 2015 letter. The legal argument was surgical. Oregon Revised Statutes 105.810. Any person who cuts timber on another's land without permission is liable for treble damages. 87,400 times 3 equals $262,200. Plus court costs, plus reasonable attorney fees if we prevailed. The letter gave Richard and the HOA 14 days to respond with full payment, a written apology to all homeowners, and immediate cessation of all forestry operations, pending independent boundary verification. It went out certified mail on Monday to the HOA corporate address, to Richard personally, and to Jennifer as board secretary. Wednesday afternoon, Richard called an emergency board meeting. I wasn't invited. It was posted as an executive session, closed to general membership. But Heather called me at 7:15 that evening. 15 cars in the parking lot, she said. More than I've seen at an executive session in 10 years. Someone's panicking. I thanked her and waited. If Richard were smart, he'd consult an attorney before responding. If he wasn't, he'd try to contain this the way he'd contained everything else, through control of the narrative and institutional pressure. Friday morning, I received Jennifer's response via email. Subject line, property dispute, settlement proposal. The email was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph acknowledged receipt of my letter, stated the board had reviewed my claims, and consulted with legal counsel. The second paragraph offered $15,000 to resolve this matter amicably without the expense and uncertainty of litigation. No admission of wrongdoing, no apology, no agreement to verify boundaries or reform contracting procedures. Just a check to make the problem go away quietly. $15,000, roughly 6% of what the law entitled me to, less than the cost of the survey and appraisal I'd already paid. It was an insult disguised as pragmatism. Take this nominal sum or face years of legal battle that might cost more than you'd win. It was the same calculation Richard had offered Heather. Settle for silence or fight alone and broken. Why didn't I take the $15,000? Because this wasn't about money. If I settled quietly, Richard would do this to the next person, and the person after that. The pattern had to break, publicly, with consequences that couldn't be negotiated away. One person taking a settlement doesn't stop a system. One person forcing accountability does. I forwarded Jennifer's offer to Daniel with a single sentence. Please file the complaint. He called me 20 minutes later. You're sure? Once we file, this becomes public record. Every homeowner in Pine Ridge will be able to read it. The HOA might fight harder to avoid setting a precedent. I said I was sure. He said he'd have the complaint ready by Monday. That weekend, I filed 3 additional complaints with state agencies. First, Oregon Department of Forestry. They enforce timber trespass laws and can conduct independent investigations. I submitted a complete evidence package, survey, appraisal, photos, demand letter, everything. The complaint form had a section asking whether I believed the trespass was intentional. I checked yes and attached Sarah's email about adjusting the boundary map to maximize timber access. Second, Oregon Department of Justice, Consumer Protection Division, HOA self-dealing, and failure to follow competitive bidding requirements violate state statutes governing planned communities. I documented 5 years of contracts to Blackwood Timber, totaling $340,000, with no evidence of a bidding process, no vendor comparison, and no disclosure of Richard's ownership interest. The complaint asked for an investigation into potential embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. Third, County District Attorney's Office. Timber trespass over a certain value threshold can be prosecuted as a felony. Planting fake survey monuments to facilitate trespass is fraud. I wasn't asking them to file charges. I was providing evidence and letting prosecutors decide if criminal statutes had been violated. The evidence spoke for itself. Fake monuments, manipulated maps, financial self-dealing, prior pattern with Heather. Each agency sent an automated confirmation email. Complaint received, assigned a case number, investigation timeline varies. I printed the confirmations and filed them chronologically. Daniel always said documentation is 90% of litigation. The other 10% is knowing when to deploy it. Monday evening, I opened my grandmother's journal again, the one from 2015. I'd read it a dozen times, but that night one entry stood out. She'd written, "This land isn't just property. It's a reminder that some things can't be taken if you're steady enough to hold them. Richard will test that. Men like him always do. But the law works if you trust it more than you fear him." She'd been right about Richard testing boundaries. She'd been right about his pattern. She'd known this fight would come, and she'd left me every tool I needed to win it. Records, surveys, correspondence, the habit of documentation. She'd taught me to fight without losing dignity, to trust evidence over emotion, to understand that preparation beats power every single time. I closed the journal and looked at the stack of filed complaints on my desk. Survey proving trespass, appraisal proving damages, financial records proving corruption. State agencies are now investigating. Civil lawsuit filing, Monday. Every piece was in position. Richard had built his system on the assumption that people would either not know their rights or not have the resources to enforce them. He'd underestimated what happens when someone knows the law, has the evidence, and refuses to accept that power trumps accountability. The system was about to prove him wrong. The mandatory homeowner meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 7 p.m. Oregon law requires HOAs to hold open meetings when formal complaints involve board conduct or financial irregularities. Daniel had filed a petition signed by 11 homeowners, one more than the required 10% threshold, demanding an emergency session to address allegations of timber trespass, boundary fraud, and self-dealing in vendor contracts. The board had 30 days to comply. They scheduled it for 22 days out, the maximum delay allowed. I arrived at 6:45. The community center parking lot was nearly full, 87 cars, more than twice the attendance of any meeting in the past decade. Inside, every seat was taken. People stood along the back wall and in the side aisles. I recognized faces I'd only seen in passing, neighbors from 3 streets over, homeowners who never attended meetings, people I'd never spoken to. Heather had saved me a seat in the 3rd row. Sarah sat 2 rows behind us. The air felt dense, expectant. Richard sat at the center of the board table with Jennifer to his right. The other 3 board members looked uncomfortable, eyes down, shuffling papers. At 6:58, Richard called the meeting to order. His voice was steady, controlled. He said the board took all members' concerns seriously and had invited me to present my allegations in a format that allowed for full transparency and response. He gestured to the podium. "You have 15 minutes. I walked to the front carrying a laptop and a document folder. Daniel had helped me prepare a presentation. No emotion, no accusation, just evidence displayed in sequence. I connected the laptop to the projector. The first slide appeared on the screen, a split image comparison. Left side, Keith's survey map showing the recorded legal boundary in red. Right side, the HOA's boundary map with the fabricated stakes in blue. The discrepancy was obvious even from the back of the room. 24 red dots marked where trees had been cut, all of them 30 to 60 feet inside the legal boundary line. "This is my property," I said. 47 acres deeded to me through inheritance, surveyed and recorded in 1987. Between April and May of this year, the HOA logged 24 Douglas fir trees from this land without permission, without notice, and without legal authority. These trees were not in the common area. They were not hazardous. They were not near the boundary. They were deep inside private property. Next slide, photos of the fake survey stakes. Keith's notes overlaid. Monument not recorded, disturbed soil, estimated placement, February to March this year. I let the room absorb that. Then the next slide, the email from Richard to Jennifer. Adjust the common area boundary map to maximize usable timber access. I read it aloud slowly. Do not correct the map. Do not verify the survey. Maximize usable timber access. I paused. That email is dated March 14th. The logging started on April 9th, 3 weeks later. Next slide, financial records showing Blackwood Timber LLC contracts. 5 years of awards. $340,000. No competitive bidding documentation. Then the Oregon Secretary of State Business Registration. Blackwood Timber LLC, principal owner Richard Blackwood. I didn't editorialize, I just let the numbers sit on screen. Final slide, the 2015 letter from my grandmother to Richard, documenting the gazebo trespass and his written apology, promising it wouldn't happen again. Next to it, the county recorder receipt showed Richard had requested the boundary file that same year. He knew the boundary in 2015, I said. He confirmed it. Then he violated it anyway. I looked at Richard. 3 questions. First, you own Blackwood Timber LLC, correct? Richard stood slowly. Yes, but there's context, I interrupted. Yes or no is sufficient. Second question, did the board conduct competitive bidding for forestry contracts between 2017 and 2024? He glanced at Jennifer. The board evaluated qualified vendors through established procedures. I waited. He added, no formal bidding process was required for projects under a certain threshold. Third question, did you review my grandmother's boundary documentation in 2015 before logging my trees in April? He straightened. That was a different matter, different context, and your interpretation, yes or no? The room was silent. Richard's jaw tightened. The situations aren't comparable. In 2015, we were addressing a specific encroachment. This year, we were conducting necessary forestry management on what our records indicated was a common area. We had reason to believe, you planted fake survey stakes, I said. You instructed your secretary to adjust the boundary map. You logged $87,000 worth of timber using your own company and billed the HOA for the removal. That's not forestry management, that's fraud. Richard's face flushed. You think you can come into this community, inherit land you never cared for, and accuse people who have served here for over a decade? I've been president of this HOA for 12 years. I've managed budgets, maintained property values, and dealt with crises you know nothing about. This is a complicated situation, being twisted by someone who doesn't understand how community governance works. Someone in the 4th row stood, an older man I didn't recognize. Answer her questions, Richard. Did you plant those stakes or not? Another voice from the left side. Why is your company getting every contract? Richard pointed at the man. That's out of order. We're not taking comments from the floor. But people were standing now, 3, then 5, then more. A woman near the back called out, "Let him answer!" Jennifer tried to interrupt. "We need to follow procedural," but Richard waved her off. His control was slipping. He looked at me, then at the crowd, then back at the projector screen, still showing his email. This is absurd. We'll address these allegations through proper legal channels, not through mob theatrics. A homeowner in the front row stood and read from a printed page. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in Richard Blackwood as HOA president, citing evidence of conflict of interest, self-dealing, and potential fraud. Someone seconded. Jennifer tried to say it wasn't on the agenda. The man said the Oregon statute allows emergency motions when board misconduct is alleged. He'd done his homework. They voted by a show of hands. 73 in favor of removal, 8 opposed, 6 abstained. Jennifer recorded the count with shaking hands. Richard stood motionless for 5 seconds. His face was dark red. Hands were gripping the edge of the table hard enough that his knuckles went white. Then he picked up his folder, walked out through the side door, and left. Didn't speak. Didn't defend himself. Just left. 12 years of authority gone in 90 minutes. After Richard left, the room erupted in overlapping conversations. Heather came over and hugged me. Her eyes were wet. 2019, I was alone, she said quietly. Tonight, you showed everyone what happens when someone refuses to back down. That's karma, Alex. That's justice. The civil lawsuit was settled 6 weeks later. The HOA's insurance carrier reviewed Daniel's evidence package and decided fighting was more expensive than paying. Settlement terms: $262,200 in treble damages paid to me within 30 days, $34,000 for reforestation costs, a written apology sent to every homeowner acknowledging the trespass and the failure of board oversight, and a commitment to retain an independent auditor to review 5 years of financial records. No confidentiality clause, no non-disclosure agreement, everything public. The criminal investigation moved more slowly, but with precision. The district attorney's office charged Richard with 2 felony counts: theft by deception under ORS 164.087 and computer crime under ORS 164.377 for manipulating digital boundary maps with the intent to defraud. The timber trespass itself became evidence of intent rather than a separate charge. Richard's attorney negotiated a plea agreement: 18 months in county jail, $125,000 in restitution to the HOA, 5 years probation, and permanent removal from any HOA board position in Oregon. He pled guilty in October. Sentencing was scheduled for January. Jennifer resigned the week after the vote of no confidence. She wasn't criminally charged. Prosecutors determined she'd followed Richard's instructions without full knowledge of the fraud, but her cooperation became part of the case file. She provided emails, meeting recordings, and financial records that Richard thought were deleted. In exchange, the DA didn't pursue charges for accessory after the fact. She moved out of Pine Ridge by November. The independent audit uncovered $78,000 in additional irregularities: landscaping invoices with inflated quantities, maintenance contracts for work never performed, and equipment rentals to Blackwood Timber that the HOA already owned. The auditor's report ran 43 pages. Every homeowner received a copy. The new interim board voted unanimously to pursue full restitution through Richard's assets: his house, his truck, and his company equipment. They froze Blackwood Timber's accounts pending civil recovery action. 4 other homeowners came forward after the meeting. Heather wasn't alone. 2 had settled with Richard in 2018 and 2020 under similar circumstances: manufactured violations, intimidation, NDAs, and timber taken without proper compensation. The new board voided those agreements, paid restitution from the recovered funds, and issued public apologies. Sarah rejoined the board by special election and led a comprehensive reform effort: mandatory competitive bidding for all contracts over $5,000, monthly financial transparency reports posted online, term limits of 4 years for any board position, and a requirement that all vendor relationships be disclosed in writing before contract awards. One homeowner wrote in the community newsletter, "We let power concentrate for too long because it was easier than asking questions. Alex didn't just protect her land. She showed us that accountability still wins when someone's willing to stand firm and trust the process. That's the standard we need to hold ourselves to now." I used the settlement money to hire a reforestation company. They planted 150 Douglas fir seedlings across the logged area, spacing them properly, mulching the root zones, and installing deer protection. I established an irrevocable conservation trust that would protect the 47 acres from development or sale in perpetuity. The land would stay forested, and I donated $50,000 to Oregon Legal Aid's HOA Abuse Clinic, funding free legal help for homeowners facing similar situations who couldn't afford attorneys. The last thing I did was plant a small memorial grove near the oldest remaining trees, 7 seedlings in a circle around a stone marker. I had it engraved with a line from my grandmother's journal: "Land doesn't lie. Some things can't be taken if you're steady enough to hold them." Standing there in late December, watching winter light filter through the remaining canopy, I thought about what my grandmother had known all along. Justice doesn't arrive on its own schedule. It arrives when someone decides they won't accept anything less, builds the case piece by patient piece, and refuses to mistake power for inevitability. The law works when you trust it more than you fear the people breaking it. Evidence outlasts authority. Truth is patient. If you found this story valuable, if it showed you that accountability is possible even against institutional power, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're facing your own HOA battle, remember, document everything, Know your rights, find your allies, and never settle for silence when you can demand transparency. Subscribe to Dear HOA for more stories like this, because every week we prove the same thing. One person with evidence and persistence can dismantle a system built on the assumption that nobody will fight back. The trees will grow back. They always do. And when they're 80 years old, they'll stand as proof that some things are worth protecting, no matter how long it takes.